Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. We apologize. We know it's been a few weeks since we've put anything out, and there is a reason for that. There has been a bit of discussion on Discord from those of you who asked, but for those of you who haven't seen that or aren't in our Discord, we're thinking of doing a format change a little bit. As a lot of you know who have listened to some of our recent episodes, you'll know it's been pretty difficult to put together episodes, just the way that content has worked out. There's been a bit of a content drought, or at least on things that we find interesting and want to cover. And it's kind of prompted us to think about doing a bit of a format change. So we've been experimenting and playing with some things, and that's why we haven't put out any content in the last couple of weeks. But we did want to put something out while we're still doing that, and we thought it would be a good opportunity to do a bit of a retrospective, talking about some of the history of the podcast, how it's changed over the years up to this point, and then I'll also use that to springboard into talking about what we want to do going forward. I think it'll be interesting, especially to some of you who haven't been around with us for since the beginning, because the beginning of the podcast looks pretty different from how it has for the last year or two, at least. We used to have monster episodes, for example, and we'll get into some of the stats on that. So yeah, Z, I'll let you start off with talking about some of the early days and whatnot.
All right, yeah. Obviously we started back in what was it, March something, 2019. It
I
was
believe it
right
was
with
March 14th of 2019. I do. Oh,
that's
March 12th. March 12th. Yeah.
yeah, that sounds about right because that was right around the release of Ghidra, which was kind of the launch point for the whole podcast for a long time, like literally years before we actually started it. Spectre and I shared some communities with the other hosts of the podcast back then, Andy. Um, it had occasionally come up, this idea of doing a podcast. Somebody would like to do that, like to have some that peels on the more technical side, all of that. It came up and it never happened, but the idea came up. Then 2019 rolls around. I guess it even might have been late 2018. Me and Auntie had kind of started up on a little business venture. I drew Spectre into that. Didn't really go anywhere, but we talked about the podcast again. Like, we liked the idea of doing something. And just, left it at that in a sense. And Spectre, with the release of Ghidra, just kind of pushed, we've talked about this, let's do something. Ghidra just came out, I'd like to talk about this. At least that's kind of how I remember it.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
let's just
Ghidra
do
was kind
it.
of a perfect catalyst for talking about some of the technical content. Because I was kind of thinking about it, and I was like, okay, I'd like to hear some discussion on Ghidra and some thoughts on that. And at the time, at least, there wasn't really a ton of podcasts that were on the technical side like that. It was mostly there was threat intel podcasts and things like that, but not really technical, or at least not that we were really aware of. So yeah, that was kind of the catalyst that got us into wanting to do stuff. It was kind of a perfect jumping off point.
Yeah, it was. It gave us something kind of concrete to talk about as like a first topic. As at that point we still had to kind of like brainstorm a name and a kind of format for it. I took a lot of inspiration on the format coming from the WAN show, which was from Linus Tech Tips. I haven't watched them in a long time, so I'm not sure if they're still formatted the same, but they would effectively just react to news off the cuff, or at least it seems more or less off the cuff. So very low overhead, just something we could stream, put it out as a podcast, and not needing to do a lot of editing, not needing to do a lot of prep work, although that did turn into doing more prep work. But yeah, our early episode, I think like our first episode, we spent taking a look at our timestamps right now. We were talking about Ghidra. Yeah, for the first half hour, we just had like a screen share going and we're talking about whatever with Ghidra. And we talked about like the backdoor discussions with there being the debugging port on the local network. And, we
I
had
almost forgot
some,
about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, I'm looking at our actual kind of topic summary here, or like I'm looking at it on the scheduler. Uh, on kind of what we talked about. We had a few issues there. We kind of had this little thing about, CV or not a CV, if it's a real vuln or not. I remember going through that episode. But yeah, that was kind of the catalyst that's starting it. And we were just talking about here's some vulns recently that seemed interesting. And most of these, I think, are kind of coming from more news resources. Yeah, like the Finding Unicorns when C++ compiler writes a vuln. Like, that one is, a ZDI post, although I do remember some of these other ones. Yeah, like the XNU copy on write behavior bypass, which I actually think I might remember this bug, but we use the link from like Wired, where this is a Project Zero post. We could have gone that route, and if we were to have done this, you like covered this today, we probably would have, uh,
We would have
gone
bypassed
right
news
to the
coverage and went right
source.
to the source. Yeah.
Yeah, but early on, we kind of had a bit more of a higher level take. With Anti on the show, he works more in threat intelligence. So we'd also kind of cover more topics like about breaches. I remember one topic where it's just about like a bunch of Disney Plus accounts were compromised, or exposed database were another thing where just like Elasticsearch, another Elasticsearch database is exposed on the internet and like everybody gets compromised there. Talk a bit about that, some PSAs. Generally, like we still kept things technical because we did want to have that focus. So like, CSGO days was our second episode talking about an O day in CSGO. We have, some, reuse gadget counts white paper. I'm just looking at the titles here. We still had our technical topics, but we also had like malware campaign being covered here. Had some of that sort of content too. I think we kind of transitioned more fully into just the technical content and really focusing there as Andy left after the first like 15 to 20 episodes. He stopped appearing on the show, just making the occasional appearances. I think it's
Yeah,
been.
his life had gotten a bit busy, so he wasn't able to do the, because like we had been pretty regular with the podcast up until recently. We were really stringent on getting episodes out on time and everything, and that just wasn't really working out too well for him. And yeah, it was kind of interesting because in those early days when we were covering the threat intel stuff, that really wasn't what Z or I were really into or had experience in. So like we were kind of able to learn from Auntie along with the audience. It was kind of a fun dynamic, but yeah, unfortunately, after those first 15 episodes or so, Auntie wasn't able to regularly appear anymore. So it shifted more into what we specialized in.
Yeah, and that was kind of thing. We started getting also a bit more on the academic side. I guess we do have some papers being covered earlier, but I feel like during that period, we probably had the point where we would cover like academic papers like at least every week or every other week at a minimum, sometimes more
We'd have
than
like two
one.
or three a week. Yeah.
Yeah, like we would cover a lot of papers, and papers were kind of a nice topic source. Uh,
It's
and
something you can
just
count on for like regular stuff coming out for like the different conferences and stuff. Like there's always going to be white papers that are being written, but some of them were a little bit outside of what we both are into as well. Like I remember we covered quite a few CNN topics, like neural network stuff, which neither of us are into machine learning, but there were a lot of white papers around that time on those topics, especially in the area of security. So those kind of got wrapped up in our coverage. Yeah.
yeah, and I'd say those topics we probably didn't cover terribly well. Like I know some of them we kind of got the highlight, like oh they bypassed this human detection by wearing this big picture on there as like a necklace or something.
A
Like
lot of the time we had to wave off like this attack works, but we don't really know why. Because like even the researchers who wrote the paper weren't like fully aware of why it happened. It was just kind of abusing those data patterns and stuff. So yeah, I mean it was kind of interesting, but yeah, it wasn't stuff we could cover very well in a technical sense.
yeah, even some things that we, even beyond the AI actually, like there were some low level crypt things like back when Shattered, the SHA
Oh, the Shaw
collision
one.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I did a lot of work trying to understand that one, but it's just also like the math on that one. Like I know your high level crypto attacks, but that was getting into like the hash coercion and like creating these tunnels so like you could flip a bit here, so it flips a bit in the output, like coercing the output. Um it got into some really crazy stuff, and it was just topics that we'd have but couldn't necessarily cover confidently. Same deal on something like the hardware side channels. Like as we got into the MDS attacks, I feel like we had a decent handle, but also kind of lacked some of the background there. At the same time, the academic content did give some of my favorite topics. Like talking about the Morpheus ship is still one of my favorite topics we've ever done, and that was all the way back on episode 9. And that was just this hardware with a bunch of mitigations on it, based off Cherry, I believe. Based on that, but had its own things on top of it. Kind of crazy chip. I went, found the paper for it. I could summarize and did all of that. Like, I really enjoyed the discussion around that, and like Project Verona on episode 25 was another one, which was just this research language that Microsoft put out. Didn't intend it to be used, but just like, here are some language ideas, and we could kind of just talk about like how that would impact things, how languages having like built-in fuzzing support is like a native part of the language, matter. That's at least one thing that I think stood out in my mind that I remember from that discussion. But I really enjoyed topics like that. But then a lot of those academic topics, you've got kind of the whole publish or perish thing going on in academia. We had questions about the methodology on a number of papers, like even when they were papers on things we could cover, like with fuzzing, like how do you compare fuzzes? It's not an easy solution, but there were some very questionable choices on some of the fuzzing papers. A lot of, technically novel, but not really novel papers too. Where it's like,
I
oh,
remember
we
the
have,
biggest problem I had on some of those papers was how the results were cherry picked. They would
yeah,
they would choose like a very specific set of targets that weren't really relevant to like where people are doing security research in. It's just like, oh yeah, we fuzzed GCC and we found bugs. It's like, okay, that's cool, and I guess it kind of demonstrates what you're going for, but it doesn't really show the practicality of it. And yeah, like you said, like there was a lot of kind of reusing or like introducing terminology to make something sound like it was new when it didn't seem to be. It was just kind of coining something basically. So yeah, it was a bit tough with the white papers, and that is ultimately why we had slowed down on covering them as the podcast went on, because I would say like those first 20-30 episodes, they were really an explorative phase for us. We weren't really sure exactly what we wanted to cover and where our strengths were with what we could cover. So we just kind of went with a lot of different things, and white papers are one of those things where, like you said, they could be a nice source of topics, but more often than not, they just things that we either couldn't really cover too well, or were just kind of rebranding existing research, not really bringing a lot of novel stuff to the table.
and they're dense. Like just in general, even if a paper was something we were good with, like they're often so dense to get through that
They took a lot of prep work.
yeah,
Yeah.
they would take just a lot of time for us to get through and be like, oh, this actually isn't even worth talking about, but we just spent an hour of our time getting to the point where we could figure that out. And that's not to knock on the papers, because the way like academic papers work is they have to provide all this background, all this information they're building off of, and like it's totally fair for them to do that, but trying to consume it on a regular, just that kind of led us away from doing papers unless it's really something special. And usually that's somebody else is recommended to check out, or like a really outstanding title or something. But yeah, we started moving away from doing the more academic topics, not because they can't be good, but just because of the amount of time it would take and the amount of false positives that would come out of it and wasted time. 'Cause again, right off the start, I wanted to make the podcast something that we could put out regularly without needing to do a lot of really heavy footwork and doing multiple papers. That led to a lot of legwork being done. And then I think kind of the next transition we really had outside of dropping the papers, or at least going with less of them, was really just came to the practical use of the episode in a sense. Like we did these absolutely massive, 2 to 3 hour long episodes sometimes. I think our longest is somewhere just over 2.5 hours.
Yeah, 2 hours
Um,
and 40 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, I think I put a bunch of stats on a blog post about our 200th episode where I definitely call it out. But yeah, it's like, over 2.5 hours. We have numerous like episodes over 2 hours. Just a marathon to even record them. But it also means like somebody's listening to them. We're going through a lot of topics. Um,
And no, like, not a lot of cohesion between them. Like we would jump between like web type topics where you're talking about like an XSS or something going straight to like a use after free, like where you have it more structured now. But back then we just kind of mix topics in there and go, and it'd be like 20 topics. So yeah, it would be kind of more difficult to listen to, but also the amount of prep work that went into it was like, I'd say probably on average maybe 4 or 5 hours on my end per episode at the
Yeah,
minimum.
it would definitely add up in terms of time. I just pulled up here one. This is I think this is episode 18 I've got up, where like we start off where we just talk about Disney. I guess this might have been the Disney Plus accounts being hacked that I remembered on episode 18, to faking a decryption proof in a verified voting system, a buffer overflow in WhatsApp, down to looks like a Symantec endpoint protection self-defense bypass. I don't remember how that worked, but like had like a wide variety of topics in one episode. And I think understandably, like
And you can
I
see in our
have
scheduler, the number of topics goes beyond the page. Like it's you have a scroll bar.
yeah, some of these were a bit more just talking about things like they're, Linux security or security things in Linux 5.3. We're just talking about a bunch of updates happening, like mitigations and stuff being introduced. uh I guess this was also an MDS topic. One of the
One of the
what does
side
MDS
channels.
stand for? Yeah, microarchitectural. Now I can't remember what MDS stands for. Either way, it was one of those like microarchitectural things that
Microarchitectural data sampling is what it
data
stood for.
sampling. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to say
That was
data
like riddled in
structure,
Fallout. Yeah.
and I'm like, that can't be it. But yeah, I understandably, I think for a lot of people, our episodes were intimidating. It's just like, we're talking about, and like I have a background doing web and binary work, so like I have no problem switching between like these high level and like desktop things like the Symantec thing and going straight into binary. Like that's my background, so it's fine. But I think for a lot of people, they don't tend to have that same sort of background. So it's like, they may be interested in web, maybe they do bug bounty work, or work as a consultant. It's like, you get the web, but you maybe haven't done like the binary level research. Or on the flip side, I know we have people who are interested on the binary, but don't care for some of these other things. So that was kind of the next shift, I think, which was just our splitting up the episodes into, at a high level, bounty and binary, but it's really just like high level versus low level issues for the most part. Little bit fuzzy on that, but that happened, finally around episode 79, where we started doing 2 episodes a week, which also kind of doubled as into giving us more time on the episodes. Where
Yeah, we could split up the prep work a little bit more and not cram all in one night sort of deal.
yeah, it's like technically you don't need to cram even these massive episodes, but we would. Just being real about our
Yeah.
workflow, like we would work on it like the night before, the day of, sort of deal. And
Well, to be fair, like we were kind of forced into cramming too because the other days of the week we would be trying to get topics together, right? Like we've always throughout the history of the podcast tried to keep our topics within the last like week or two. For the most part, outside of maybe the papers we were a little bit more lenient on because those are, you know, uh, they're not as time sensitive, so to speak. But yeah, because of the fact that we were getting topics together and stuff, it's like we had to do that before we could do the prep work, and then it's like we can't get the topics together like 4 or 5 days before the episode or something, right? So that kind of limited on when we could do it. And when we
yeah,
had
fair
these monster
point.
episodes, it was like, yeah, it was the weekend was when we had to do all the prep work.
Yeah, my cutoff on topics was usually trying to do Friday cutoffs, Friday or Saturday, but that wasn't a strict thing. But so we really only had Saturday, Sunday, bit of Monday to work on things. So splitting up into 2 days kind of meant the topics that we'd cover on the second day, the binary episodes, we'd have a bit of extra time. It made things feel a lot nicer when we were able to do that. So it was nice for us to do that. It made our work easier. And I think for a lot of listeners, it also helped that they'd have an episode that they could listen to and enjoy without necessarily having these random things tossed in there too. Also gave us a bit more structure to work off of instead of mixing everything together.
Yeah, I was gonna say it made it a lot easier for us to try to make through lines. Like we started grouping topics together on, or we'd try to. We weren't always perfect on it, but we'd try to keep topics that were somewhat similar or in the same sorts of targets together. Um, and we couldn't really do that with the way that we had the episodes before, or at least it was a lot harder to do that. So yeah, the bounty binary split was very helpful all around. I think it was a good move. And yeah, people seem to appreciate it. And yeah, like you were saying, it lightened the workload on me a lot, uh,
Yeah, it
personally.
yeah, even if the hours were about the same, I think having them split over the couple days of doing that, the research on the topics helped out a lot and just made it feel better because it wasn't like an entire day being dedicated. It was the couple hours here and a couple hours the next day or something. Like it was a lot easier for me too, and I appreciated that change quite a bit. And we've
Yeah,
stuck with that for a good while.
up until pretty much now. We stuck with that for 3 or
Um
4 years.
okay, so we stuck with that format, although I will say I think it was during last season. Um and in my head I kind of split seasons based off of when we've done our breaks. So
That
like
is
when we've
something I
gone
was
on
going to bring up too. Is yeah, where we've always taken the breaks, that did offer a good opportunity to, like before we'd start each new season or coming back in September, we would kind of think like, is there anything we want to change or tweak? Like, it'd be a good opportunity to do it, and that's kind of how we'd always try to structure our changes. Yeah.
yeah, although this last one that I'm thinking of actually kind of happened in the middle where you expressed just finding a lot of these topics in the web, especially on the website, being rather tedious to get through. And this wasn't like a really obvious format change. But I have a random episode up here. Let me just figure out what episode number this is. This was episode 85. So on episode 85, so this was early on, like you can see we have several kind of topics here. You'll see here for episode 85, like, this was one of our kind of split episodes. Like we had already started splitting things still fairly early on in that time period. This is one of our bounty issue or one of our bounty topics where we talk about a Mac OS Finder RC. If I remember correctly, that had to do, I don't think it was a zip slip, but it did have to do something with the unpacking process. Uh it doesn't really matter what these were, but we just had a few issues, and I remember especially you'd kind of rage just feeling a bit bored, especially on the web, and Bounty said maybe this isn't the best example because I think some of these issues were kind of interesting. But you'd kind of expressed that, so I had started changing my focus when it came to topic selection to look for kind of some key points on one, is there something novel in this topic, something that I could call it was like, this is new to me, or something I haven't seen in a while. I would also call it those things where it's like, this is a really old bug that they're still exploiting today, and like call it out like that. And looking for takeaways, trying to make the topics that we're actually choosing more interesting rather than just this came out in the last week, so we can talk about to this is good research from the last week or last couple weeks that we can talk about. And like it applies to other things, especially
And I
on the
do kind of
binary
want
side.
to
Go ahead.
I do just want to say, like, on the bounty side, the reason I was finding that to be the case on bounty was just because, like, the whole meta of doing bug bounty hunting is you want to try to get as many issues as possible because individual issues aren't going to be like paying out a lot generally, right? So the meta is like trying to find a bug class or something and then finding variants of that and just like rapid reporting of them. So you get that fatigue of seeing the same things over and over a little bit more on the bounty side than the binary side. So yeah, that was something we did want to try to avoid, because not only just for our sake, but also because I just felt like listening, if you're just like, oh yes, here's another X thing that we talked about last week as well. Like, I feel like that would get stale to listen to as well. So that's why we wanted to have a little bit more of that novelty focus.
Yeah, and to be clear, like I am kind of in a sense blaming Spectre. Like Spectre raised that whole fact about getting finding him a little bit tedious. I've always kind of really enjoyed our bounty episodes and the approach there, but I know Spectre, you don't have a very deep web background, and you're a lot more on like the
Yes.
low level and lower level than even the binary stuff, doing the hardware and such. Uh, it was something I was feeling too. I think it was prompted. I recall a specific discussion between us post in like one of our post episode discussions where I'm like, okay, I'm going to actually actively make this change and focus more on novelty and on having takeaways from these rather than just here are topics.
Yeah, I will say it was kind of interesting because I was, as you say, I was weaker on the bounty side, like on the web and those higher level sorts of issues. I didn't have as much exposure to them simply because I wasn't as interested in them. I'd always kind of tunneled in on the lower level. But where you had done the consulting work and stuff, you had kind of had the opposite experience where you were interested in the low level, but you were more exposed to like the kinds of topics we cover on the bounty episode. So because of that, like the bounty episodes gave me the opportunity to get that exposure and learn where I otherwise wouldn't have, like fill some of the knowledge gaps, so to speak. So that was kind of a cool thing that I never really called out because it wasn't really relevant to the topics that we were covering, but it was something that was able to benefit me as well, where I didn't have as much exposure there. But as you say, my interest has always been more on the lower level side.
Yeah, so kind of makes sense that you might be first to consider some parts of it more tedious than others. Either way, it led to that change, and I don't have an actual source for that on exactly when it was, but if you compare like the episode I've got here where we have five actual vulnerability topics that we talked about here. And I'll just pull up one of our more recent episodes, one of the more recent bounty episodes where, in this case, we have three topics. One's a somewhat research thing, one's a shout out, and then we have two kind of vulnerabilities. I remember the CSP wildcard thing was slightly going more towards a shout out, but I did explain it. But we only had like three real topics there. And that's kind of the big change is, I dropped the number and started having more folks on this being interesting research for us to do. And even at this point, like I started making that change just so I be like, here are novelties, here's something that people can take away from it. And actually have gain something from listening to us rather than hearing us say this is yet another unbounded string copy on the binary episode. That's very common sort bug class. I feel like it was less applicable actually on the on the bounty side that we'd be covering the same bugs. There were some bugs like the path talk tos, the sim linking on Windows thing.
Yeah, that's one
Some
that's
of
been a
those
recurring
were
thing.
Yeah, some of those were really common, but they just kind of got dropped.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fair because we kind of talked about bounty there, but binary had a very similar issue where it's like with memory corruption, there's only so many different bug classes and stuff you can have. And that's kind of why, as the podcast went in, we also started introducing some hardware style topics into binary episodes. Not exactly memory corruption, but it's still that low level focus where you got the reversing involved and things like that. So we still felt it would apply. And I've had a growing personal interest in hardware as well. So it was easy to kind of toss those topics in there. But just generally over time, like the more topics that we cover, it was always in the back of my mind where it's like, the more we cover, you can't have novel research every day. You can't be a hero every day. So there's inevitably going to be a little bit of fatigue that builds up over time. And that kind of contributed to our narrowing down of topics as well, as it's just, we wanted to try to find newer things. And the more we cover, the harder that is to do. So
yeah, the more we cover, the more likely it is that we're going to say we talked about this a little while back or on episode whatever.
Yeah, and I don't want to have to say that like all the time, right? And people don't want to have to listen to that all the time, I'm sure.
Well, what was interesting on the binary side, like I would occasionally, so oftentimes how it would work is I would kind of go through and find our topics. Spectre would maybe add some things in every so often from what he came across, but I would kind of dedicate the time to finding our topics.
You took the lead on that, yeah.
Yeah. And oftentimes, not necessarily often, but on the binary side, I would sometimes add topics because I would just glance through them like, what's the vulnerability in here? That's kind of what I'm looking for. What's the vulnerability? Is there exploitation? Is that exploitation like using some different sort of strategy, or is it just like your standard thing? Like, basically, again, what can I talk about and what's the novelty here? What's the takeaway novelty? So I would just kind of look through them like that. And there were times where I would add, and like Spectre would be like, yeah, we talked about this vulnerability before. It's just a new write up for it. And like, before I actually went through to look in detail at it, he'd usually be doing his notes before I would on that front. And would just call like, we've covered this exact vulnerability. Like, we've already talked about this. And that would happen a lot on the binary side, never really on the bounty side. And that's kind of more of a thing on the binary side where people will like exploit and look at the same vulnerability a lot more often than somebody will look at like the same bug bounty report. They'll
Yeah,
have
because
at
like
least
bounties and stuff are generally going to be killed once they're reported. Like binary, the bugs have a lot more longevity to them.
yeah. Um, but it kind of led to this point where, as you were saying, we'd kind of cover these same topics over and over. Like, even if it wasn't the same bug, we would have the same sort of bug class very frequently, and it got hard to actually find new topics to cover. And in fact, the last so there are some topics now, but like when we kind of started our impromptu break here, like it had been at least 3 weeks where it's like we have no topics for binary. Like, I am frantically looking for episodes right before we start or looking for topics right before we start the episode. 'Cause I'm like, I want at least 3 topics, even if it's like a shout out or something. I was trying to hit that. And I mean, something we kind of have never really done was just add content for the value. We have gone or add vulnerabilities just for the sake of it. We always need something to talk about. That's
Yeah.
where we started adding discussions in there. So I don't
Yeah,
want to
so I
make
did
it.
want to
Oh,
expand a little bit
go on.
on our philosophy because like we generally don't try to pad out episodes. We don't try to add topics like, oh, we want to try to hit like an hour or a half hour. As those of you who have listened to us for a while have noticed, like we sometimes have episodes that go an hour and a half, and sometimes we have episodes that go half an hour. Like there's not really a standard time. There's quite a lot of deviation there. But the one thing we do try is we want to try to hit at least like 20 to 30 minutes. We don't really want to put out like a 5 minute podcast episode because that just seems kind of silly to do. And the last couple weeks there, like it felt like we would be putting out like literally like 10-minute episodes, and we didn't really want to do that. So just to explain a bit of the methodology there, like we don't care about time a lot, but we do kind of have a floor of where we want to try to hit at least that.
Yeah, we've come in under it a couple times. I think we've done some 15 to 20 minute episodes. Might
I
have to
think
double
we had a
check
few
that.
20 minutes. I don't think we've had any under 20, but yeah, we've had a few 20-minute
Yeah,
episodes.
I'm not sure offhand. I thought we had some that were in like the 18-minute range, but either way, like, I even didn't care too much about the minutes. I'm just like, I at least want some topics. Like, I don't want to do a single topic on an episode or something. Like, 3 always felt like the right number for me.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to just add something for the sake of adding it either. And what happened on the binary side is we had no topics. Like, at one point there, it's like there are no topics here, and then we did the future of
Yeah.
exploit dev discussion. And it kept going where it's like, yeah, there were some releases, but they weren't things that either fell into novelty, having some novelty, or something that could have a takeaway. I think an example of that is Mo put out that MTE post about like bug on a pixel that bypassed MTE. Sounds really cool, but then when you look at it, it's like it's a bug in an area where the primitive just one, it's not really applicable unless you're specifically like working in with the GPU. Like, it just has certain primitives that aren't available anywhere else. So it's not really applicable if you're, looking for bugs anywhere else. Like, it's same reason why we started dropping like like deep Chrome vulnerabilities is like, yeah, there's some complex bugs in the like JIT systems and like the compiler there, optimizer and all of that, but it's not applicable to anybody who's not doing that. And
That's
those
kind
are
of
just
important to
hard
bring
to
up.
cover.
Yeah, that so I do want to say this. Part of what contributed to making the binary episodes harder as well is like in years past, we did enjoy covering like browser issues and the kernel issues and stuff like that. But because the cutting edge moves so quickly, especially on the browser front, it's gotten to a point where not only are the bugs and exploits hyper specific to those targets, and where we like to try to cover things that could be, leveraged elsewhere, something like that, like it doesn't fit that category, but also they become a lot harder for us to do coverage on because I don't actively do browser research. So a lot of the browser knowledge that I have has quickly become fairly dated. And these write-ups, like especially browser, like I've said it before, browser is the most complicated code base in the world, I think. I don't think you really have more complicated code bases than that. And these JIT bugs required so much background information that I didn't really know, that I would have to go into research, and I would be spending probably hours doing that. And then trying to properly cover that, especially for like audio only listeners, it just didn't seem practical. So we were kind of forced into dropping those kinds of topics. And that's just an unfortunate consequence of how the cutting edge, like how hard things have gotten on those types of targets. And then the targets that are left are more of like your IoT type stuff, where it's like copy paste kind of bugs, and something else I wanted to bring up too is that we don't always just exclusively want to focus on the bugs. We always like talking about the exploits too, and the exploit strategies. But again, because of how the cutting edge targets have moved on and stuff, you're mostly left with the same exploit strategies being taken advantage of. Like, oh, it's just we ropped to, like, we hijacked a function pointer and we ropped to victory. Like, that's, it's cool, it works, but there's nothing fun to talk about there, really. We like to talk about some interesting things in the exploit strategies, and those just didn't come up super often. Don't get me wrong, they still came up. Like, we've talked about some cool stuff this year and whatnot, but it's just less and less frequent as time goes on. Seems to be the pattern.
Yeah, there isn't much to say when it is just hijack the function pointer, and got their ROP chain going. Like, there isn't a lot to say there. On the more
or like the
technical
Linux
things,
kernel,
we
for
could
example,
talk.
doing like a mod probe path. Like, that was interesting
Yeah,
the first time we saw it, but it's like now that's just the go-to exploit strategy.
yeah, like, um, what I was going to mention about Many Mo's post and MTE was just that one, like, we kind of ended up I think I made it a shout out specifically, not so much just dropping it, but it sounds interesting at the outset, but then it's the primitive is very specific onto more the GPU, where it's dealing with physical pages and doing some of that, just access that you're not generally having in like other things. It's like, yeah, bypass MDE because the normal primitive in that area didn't require anything that MT would stop. If I'm recalling it correctly, like, it was
Yeah, so you basically
interesting.
just don't have to deal with it because your primitive is so powerful, which is awesome. Like, it's awesome that you have a bug and exploit that works that way. I don't want to try to take away from the post, but it's just like, yeah, it's not something that's sort of generic that can be applied to other things. It's specific to that bug.
Yeah, like, again, that's where the takeaways come into it. Unfortunately, it does mean we've probably cut out some decent topics that just would take too long for us to kind of invest the time to understand, especially around the browser. But I
It
mean,
feels
we
bad when we
both,
do that, but like, yeah, we can't really afford to put like, 12 hours of prep work or something into an episode each week. Like, it's just it's too much. So we have to have like a line of reasonable prep work, and unfortunately, like the browser stuff and those kinds of topics just kind of crossed it.
well, to me though, even on the browser side especially, just because those were also so focused, even if it's interesting because it doesn't apply elsewhere, also kind of means like the value proposition of it to me, like in terms of any of our listeners, and like when I'm thinking about what people would want to hear, it's like it could be cool or it could be interesting and like unique or something, but they're not going to necessarily apply that to like any other area of research. Kind of a similar thing where it comes to just if it requires you really understand a bunch of internals of the system in order to understand the exploit. So I think it's both of those things that kind of add into it. It's the fact that it's not widely applicable, even if it's interesting, and it's going to take us a long time to actually get up on those. And like I mentioned off at the start, like one of the ideas here was like in podcast we could put out without needing to do a lot of that legwork on. We'll do some, of course, but we don't want it to be like a new job or something. So that I think kind of takes us up to, in a sense, where we're at now, because I was just talking about literally some weeks ago where it's like we have no topics. And so during that where I'm like, we have no topics here, like something needs to change. We need to start doing something different because like we can't just drop the episode, which I think was another thing we had kind of talked about. Just okay, this week we're not going to do that episode, but then it screws up the numbering and all that comes into it, which isn't that big of an issue, but it's not the approach we wanted. It's like something else needs to change here. And this is finally getting into here's what's happening with Day Zero Sec. We've kind of talked about something's changes just in the weeks prior to actually having it come to a head, where we were talking about like we want to make some changes. It just in terms of the time we're investing into this, it doesn't feel like it's really paying off, really worthwhile. Simple example there is, our Day Zero Sec has this little vulns page where we've written summaries. So as we cover vulnerabilities, we'd write up these summaries about them. I'm opening one just as an example here, which looks like it was just a string. Oh, right. This was a string copy thing. It was a stupid vulnerability, but kind of fun because it was in the terminal, like inline the escape code commands. It was just kind of an interesting area. But we've written up all these summaries, nearly 600 of them at this point,
which is
hoping
crazy.
that would
I didn't
kind
realize
of
we had done that many.
well, just doing like the few a week, it adds up. And we've
Yeah,
been
for sure.
lazy with it at times. Like I think the last couple episodes we haven't really done it. We haven't tagged them all. Like I do have some here tagged as like cool vuln and kind of what type vulns are in there. And some you can see just don't have any tags. We've been lazy on some of it, but that just comes down to like I don't remember what the stats were that I was telling you just before the show, but like, we'll do all of this effort and like nobody's really visiting these pages. Like I can see like the top 50 or 20 pages or whatever in the last month. And like, less than like 16 people were visiting any one of these actual vulnerability pages. Not very many people are seeing anything we're putting out there, which I mean, it's not that we're doing it for that, but at least with these summaries, like part of my idea was maybe if we're searchable, people can find the vulnerabilities and find us that way.
Yeah, so like the main thing with the summaries, the reason we had originally started doing them was just for our benefit, just so that like if Z had gotten to a report before I did, or vice versa, we kind of write up a summary of it, and then the other could read it, get an idea of what the topic was about, and that would make reading the topic easier. And then it was like, okay, well, if we're writing these summaries, then these kinds of summaries might be interesting to other people out there as well, that like our listeners and whatever. So we might as well publish them as well. So that's kind of where the summaries came from. Now, to be fair, we never really called a ton of attention to the fact that we had like a vulnerabilities page. Some people had noticed, we've linked it a few times, but it's not something we've actively pushed. So it's probably partly just people didn't really know it was there. But yeah, the
The hope
SEO and
was it would
stuff
be
was
searched,
some of
but
the hope of it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't know SEO stuff, so it's not like these pages are optimized for that. I would,
Well, this is kind of an aside, but also SEO and search engines in general have just gotten so terrible. Like this year, especially, it's so bad. I don't even really use Google that much anymore.
shout out for Coggy. I'm just going to say it. I'm going to shill right now. It's a paid search engine. I typed that's not it. That is it. For Coggy here, no ads, fast personalized result. I've been using it since they were in a free beta. I've absolutely loved it. I used to use DuckDuckGo, and every so often or relatively frequently, I would use like a Google Bang to go search Google again. Uh, with Coggy, I still occasionally use a Google Bang, especially with localized searches like weather or something. I go over to Google for that. I didn't mean for this to turn to like me shilling, but at the same time, I've been really happy paying for a search engine because I use a search engine every single day, many times a day. That it
Yeah, and
makes sense
it's
just to
fair to
pay
bring up
for it.
because Because yeah, like a lot of security researchers and stuff that I know that I talked to have been like so down about how bad searching has got, because when you're reversing and whatnot, like that's that's your main tool, and it sucks right now. It's gotten worse. So but yeah, that's kind of an aside just attached to the SEO part of
It
it.
is, but I've been very happy with them, so I did want to shout that out. And they're also the type of search engine that would rather return no results than bad results. So that maybe gives you a feel for it too. You might not get results, but you're not going to waste time looking at bad results either. Anyway, yeah, we haven't done SEO great. That that is also a very obvious thing with us. Nonetheless, I more pulled that out just like we've put a lot of effort into our episodes, and the Volans were both kind of for that being searchable. Also, just as a way of being able to share things, because now there's actually a link to like a specific vulnerability that's like, if you wanted to share a discussion on a vulnerability, you could share this sort of link. And actually, like, if you click play on the episode here, I'm not going to, but like it'll take you right to our discussion, like the timestamp for and all that. Has some of those sorts of features, and it just really hasn't gotten out there. Like basically, a lot of our content and a lot of our effort is being lost in being this sort of podcast format where maybe it's interesting, maybe you appreciate our coverage of a vulnerability, but nobody's going to be able to find it in the middle of a podcast.
Yeah, so the way I would say it is I've met people in person who have like been active listeners to the podcast, and they say they like it, and I've really appreciated it. Like it's really helped us with continuing to wanting to do the Day Zero stuff. So we do really appreciate like all of you who actively listen. But outside of the people who like the podcast as a whole, that's where I think we were struggling to get other people on board, where it's like if people were interested in a particular discussion or just a particular topic and didn't want to tune in for the whole podcast, uh like our podcast format just isn't really good for that. You do have YouTube timestamps, but for any of the other platforms like Spotify or whatever, that doesn't really work. And even YouTube timestamps are somewhat janky, and yeah, it's just like you say, like people who wanted to get a specific thing, it's not easy with the way that we have the podcast currently. So that's kind of got us thinking of how we want to do the format change.
yeah, and like Spectre said, I appreciate everybody who has been listening and those who do find benefit in it. It's just like when we put out an episode, generally speaking, like a lot of the effort we're putting into this is kind of dead within a month. Like we get the occasional like listener of an old episode. There are a couple discussions, especially if it makes our title, that people will tune in specifically for, like reviewing a book or what actually still one of our common things people go back to is when I reviewed OSWE and the certification. Back that was back in like I think that was episode 11. Like that was like right before we went on our first break. And that still gets a lot of views. So like some of those things will come, but a lot of the vulnerabilities here don't really get any follow up. So it's kind of raising the question of how do we make these more consumable and just like make our own work last a bit longer and more useful to more people. Um, and so I think kind of the solution that we're kind of thinking of now and kind of coming in on the format changes here is pulling out some of these technical. Well, so it's kind of dealing with two problems. The other problem is just the topics and having good topics versus having enough topics. It's pulling out our vulnerability summaries, having one more focus on being able to highlight good and interesting research rather than just having enough content for the week, where sometimes maybe some of the posts were a little bit questionable. Um, so would be taking that, pulling them out of the podcast and basically dedicating the appropriate amount of time to them so we can actually talk about the background, give people an understanding of the vulnerability, still making it like a summary, but putting more effort, more time into those videos, and putting them out as standalone videos, where we can share the code, we can, have visualization of things and do all of that to really explain and cover these vulnerabilities without being pressed on the same kind of time format we are, where it's every week we need like several vulnerabilities, we need to get the summaries for all of these, we need to do that, and giving them basically the time that they're due, and also being able to look at good research, even if it wasn't necessarily the last week. Maybe combining multiple vulnerabilities into one, not just like here's a vulnerability, but here's kind of a not necessarily a bug class, but like similar issues. But being able to dedicate, I think, the amount of
Like
time
variants, yeah.
appropriate to explain these issues and just give a good understanding of them. So yeah, that's kind of the first thing, is just pulling those out of the podcast, making them as a standalone thing, because yeah, the podcast isn't the best format for coming to an understanding about these vulnerabilities anyhow. And then
We kind
putting
of shoehorned them in, so to speak, because we mainly wanted to do the discussions, but then it's like, well, how do we discuss a vulnerability if nobody knows the context? So it's like, okay, we have to summarize it and cover it and go into what's being talked about, and then we can do the discussion. Whereas, the main thing that we wanted to do was a discussion. So yeah, we were kind of shoehorning in the summarizing of the vulnerabilities into the podcast, where it wasn't the best format for that.
yeah, and I mean, the thing that we do like is doing like when we're able to basically talk shop. We have a mitigation here, like how's this actually going to impact us, or how's this going to impact our sort of work, or how's this going to impact things in general? Does this improve security, whatever? Or we have a vulnerability. Like there are cool things that we like talking about. Um and so that's still going to remain the podcast, or at least the current plan is that we'll still keep our meta discussion like about some of the vulnerabilities as part of as what we put out as a podcast. We'll still have discussions as part of the podcast, but we'll pull out the technical descriptions of a vulnerability into its own thing. And then, if we're talking about on there and you want the full breakdown of a vulnerability, you can see like the full breakdown of it and have that resource, and still kind of have us talking about, and hopefully being able to get some guests on and having more interviews, more discussions with vulnerability researchers, whatever. Uh and kind of as a side note, if you have an idea for a guest, feel free to reach out and suggest someone for us, or make that
Or if
connection if
you'd
you're
be
able
interested in
to.
being a guest as well.
That too.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, part of the thing that would be nice for moving the technical discussions out of the podcast and into independent videos is where we could spend more time on them and like properly script them up and do editing and such. We can spend time on doing like visual aids and just put time into trying to break down the vulnerability better. Whereas on the podcast, we were kind of limited by like, we're covering it live, so to speak. Now, we haven't been live since last year, which is something we kind of skipped over, but we used to do the podcast live all the time, and then we went to the VOD format. But even when we weren't doing the live streams, we're kind of sitting on the call trying to talk about something, and we can only go as far into the vulnerability as what we can cover within like our 10 to 20 minutes. We're not going back afterwards and figuring out, like trying to figure out what we might have messed up and see if there's some gaps we can fill. Whereas when we pull them into independent videos, we can do that. We can do like more polished coverage of the issues and go deeper on them than we could on the like in a live setting.
Yeah, I think we could really do some of the research justice in terms of being able to pull them out into their own thing, but it will mean we're covering less vulnerabilities in general. There's
Less
no way we would be
vulnerabilities,
able to
but
do
more in
that.
depth is kind of the idea.
More
The
in
trade-off.
depth, and hopefully better quality. Having that higher quality, both in terms of our own content, but of the research itself, because we're not trying to make that weekly aspect. I think we still plan to put out content frequently, but we're not going to hold ourselves like, I mentioned wanting to have like 3 topics. Probably not going to be able to put out like 3 vulnerability videos every single week. So I'm not sure what our publishing schedule will actually look like with this, but that's kind of our plan going forward. Is let's focus in on giving good content in a consumable way, and just leave the discussions to the podcast, and give more on that side of thing, which fits a podcast better. And hopefully, like, we'd want to pull on like technical guests. We're not wanting to become like a This Week in Security, or we've had offers of some pretty high, like We had one guest offer, some company wanted to be a guest. I don't think they actually looked too much into the show. Just like, oh, this is a security podcast. They must want this where we could have somebody explaining the importance of vulnerability management. I forget what it was exactly, but like, no, we want technical people on the show. We still want to be talking about vulnerabilities. We don't want to lose the technical aspect and the appeal to a technical audience, but we do
Yeah,
want to pull
that
the
was the whole
technical
premise
content
of
in.
why we wanted to launch the Day Zero stuff.
Yeah. So we
Yeah.
don't want to lose that. I'd love to have people who are doing vuln research on come and talk methodology, talk whatever. I mean, whatever, to some degree, whatever's on their mind too. Like give people the freedom to talk about what they want. But yeah, we still want to keep it all technical. It's just we want to pull the really technical stuff out into its own content form so that we can do it justice. And so that we could feel like we're actually providing like more value out of it and all of that. So yeah, that's, I think, kind of where we're at. Again, if you'd like to be a guest, have somebody you'd like to hear us talk to. We haven't done a lot of the interview stuff. I think we've only done we've had CTS on, I think, a couple times, and
we've had Bastian Gruber. We've had a few
yes.
people. We've done some discussion videos with Drugi. That's outside of the podcast, but we have done videos on that. So we have gotten a few interview style content pieces out in the past, but very few and far between. But we would like to do a bit more regular, coverage like that, because the times that we have done it, it's been very instructive. Like even just to Z and I, like we've been able to have some really cool discussions that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to have. The sorts of discussions that you'd have, like, at a conference or something, if you're out for drinks or something, like that kind of vibe is very cool, and we would like to do that more. But yeah, we can't make promises on that. And I guess on that front, the other major change that's coming is, over the years with the podcast, as I said, for the most part, barring some crazy stuff that happened in my life at the end of last year, we've been pretty regular. Like we've always gone out at like the same time, same dates. We've been pretty good with adhering to a schedule. But with what we're planning on doing, it will not be really scheduled anymore. So the podcast would just kind of be when we have things we want to talk about and some interesting topics, we'll put it out. Not trying to stick to like a weekly basis or something. Like we do still want to try to put out content. Like, we don't want to try to go months without content or anything like that outside of our summer break. But it's not going to be a scheduled like date and time for things, and that might be a bit of a stark change for some people who were like relying on that for listening on a commute or something. At least for the moment, we're probably not going to be scheduling content in the near future for what we're trying to do, and part of that is because we're going to be new to doing it, and we're going to have to revisit that exploration phase like we had some years ago with the podcast, as it has been. So
yeah, along with just picking up some new skills to actually do some of that video work. We still plan to put out content regularly. It's not that we're just going to go silent for like a month even. It's just like Spectre said, we want to be able to highlight good research, good content. So with that, we're not always going to have it every week to put out. We're not always going to have that super regular publishing schedule as we're learning, especially. Hopefully in time, like we could have a backlog of content and then we could actually have a schedule and do that. But it will take us some time to get there. So you'll have to bear with some irregularity while we actually get up there. But yeah, I mean, that feels like everything I think we've wanted to hit on here.
That covers pretty much everything that we wanted to update. Go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add there is I would ask, like, if you have some feedback, if you like the idea, if you don't like it, if you had something you liked with the podcast format, whatever, like, feel free to reach out and leave us some feedback. Apparently not through Twitter, because I thought Twitter would tell us we got a message. It didn't, so I had people who messaged us over the past several months who we just completely ignored, and I feel terrible for that, honestly. Yeah. I had no idea we had messages because Twitter didn't tell us.
Twitter's UI is really horrible for DMs. I find I've like on my personal Twitter, I've had the same issue where I've saw someone DM'd me like a month ago, and I was like, "Damn, sorry, like I wasn't trying to blow you off. I just generally didn't no, you sent this message.
Yeah,
So
and I
yeah,
feel
try to avoid
terrible.
Twitter. Like the Discord is probably the best. That's what we check in with a lot. Our Discord is the best avenue for that. And yeah, like what we're planning on doing and whatnot, like we're nothing set in stone with what we want to do yet. We're still kind of exploring, so that feedback would be very useful if you do have any to provide. So that's a good shout.
Yeah, we always do appreciate the feedback when we get it, 'cause it does kind of help guide us. But so if you have something, you hate it, you love it, you love the idea, whatever, let us know, because like if you actually don't like it, the only way we're going to know people hate it is with feedback. So, feel free to reach out and let us know, please.
Yeah.
But this is the plan going forward.
Yeah. And I do want to say we are still like planning to do like the summer breaks and such because, it's like conference season and just generally nice to be outside season. So we are still going to be taking that break, and we're kind of butting up against that right now. So we're going to try to get some content out, at least in the form of discussions over the next couple weeks. But towards the end of May, we are still going to be taking that summer break, just as a heads up.
Although I have a feeling our summer break, we're also going to be learning more on the video stuff and still get some things out. So hopefully this time we'll actually put out content during the summer break. But we
Yeah,
have
and
said
where
that every
we're
break.
we have said that a lot, yeah. But where we're not like stuck to a schedule, it will be easier to do that as well. It'll be easier to put stuff out during the summer because we're not going to have to worry about putting something out for this week or that week. We can just kind of find time between when we're doing stuff to get stuff out. So yeah, probably won't be like, it won't be as much during the summer, but yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get some stuff out this year as well because of that change.
Yeah. And I will say one aspect of the podcast we didn't actually talk about like at all here was Spalt the Vuln, which was my favorite part. It just got so hard to make vulnerabilities week after week after week. I
Again, you
absolutely
have that
love it.
problem where it's like you can only have so many different kinds of bugs, or it's like, and especially when you're limiting to yourself to bugs that can fit onto like a few lines of code.
And be solved relatively quickly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard. I did enjoy it, but I'm not sure. I'd like that to come back in some form, but I'm not sure what format that'll look like. But it's still something I'm thinking about, 'cause it's still something I very much liked.
And it was a part of our podcast for a very long time. It was only up until like what was it, like October or something, that we'd stopped doing it, really. I think when we stopped doing the live streams, because we used to do the live streams and then we'd cover it. People would try to solve it and give ideas in chat, and when we stopped live streaming, that interaction was kind of lost, and we were just like, okay, we'll stop doing the Spot the Volume too, because it's at that point we had already reused a fair amount of the Spot the Volumes sometimes, because like I said, like it's hard to come up with a lot of them, and we have over 250 episodes at this point. So
Yeah.
but yeah, it is a very cool thing, and yeah, we do want to try to bring it back. That's a good shout. I didn't think about it earlier. We should have.
Yeah, I realized I didn't include that in like talking about the phases of the podcast, but that was kind of a missing aspect there. But worth calling out. But yeah, there's not much to say on that.
Yeah, but yeah, as you say, I believe that's everything. So yeah, we were kind of able to go into that review of how we've done things in the past and the changes we made and what we're planning to do going forward. We'll include a timestamp and everything for the update for those who are mostly interested in that. But yeah, so that's everything. Again, apologies for not really having anything out the last couple weeks. Even this podcast is going to be a little bit late in the week as for when we usually release things. But yeah, that's kind of what's been going on. And we appreciate that feedback. So if you have some thoughts, even just some suggestions on what we've already talked about, maybe some specific details that you think would be interesting, or styles, yeah, we'd love to hear that too. And again, our Discord is the best place for that, and you can find the link for that in the video or on our website, day0sec.com. And with that said, thank you everyone, and we'll see you on the next podcast episode.